Die energiekenner Chris Yelland kuier vanmôre saam met ons en ons gaan spesifiek praat oor die energiekrisis op hierdie stadium in Suid-Afrika. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning to you and your listeners.
Thank you very much. Chris, we do have a bit of an energy crisis, let's admit it, not only with Eskom, but also with the fuel price and availability of crude oil coming from overseas markets. Are we in a position in South Africa at this stage where we should be worried about our energy?
Yeah, absolutely. We should be. We are in, I believe, kind of energy emergency. And if we don't take the necessary actions, this is going to move from being an emergency to a state of disaster. That is if we move into the area of a regional or national blackout. And we should, and business and consumers, farmers, industrialists, commercial people are in fact already starting to take the necessary actions to ensure their security of supply. And a kind of quiet revolution is taking place as people start to make their own plans. And certainly in my own case, I'm ready for a power failure or load shedding at any moment. And I have a necessary battery backup system that can see me through for 8 hours. And I would say that most businesses have made plans or are making plans already.
Wow. Chris, realistically, what are the chances of a total blackout? Is it really like a 90% chance that there will be a total blackout? And if we do experience a total blackout, how easy is it to recover from something like that, to bring the lights back on?
Yeah, so I want to, first of all, I don't want to be alarmist in any way. The probability of a national blackout is still very low. However, the risk is not insignificant. And let me try and explain. Risk is a combination of the probability of an event occurring and the consequences of an event. So if you're an insurance company and you're looking at risk, what is my risk? You have to look at what is the probability and what is the consequences. So even though a probability may be very low, the consequences may be so high that the risk is uninsurable. And I'll give you an example. A nuclear accident is not insured by any insurance companies, the consequences of a nuclear accident. Simply because the risk is so high, but the probability of it happening is incredibly low. The same applies to a national blackout. The probability is low, but let's just talk about the consequences. If we were to be without power for a week or more, there would be no water. You would not be able to get food in the shops. The shops would be closed. The ATMs wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to draw money from your local ATM. You wouldn't be able to get petrol. The country would be plunged into total darkness for more than a week. And there would be looting and violence on a scale in the streets, on an unimaginable scale across the country, much more than the previous looting in Durban and Gauteng. So the consequences are unimaginable. An insurance company once spoke to me recently, a reinsurance company, one of the biggest in South Africa, to say that they'd done their sums and they were worried, very worried, because the total capitalization of the insurance and reinsurance industry in South Africa would not be able to cover the claims that they would face if there was a national blackout. That gives you an idea of the risk, and they are busy looking at their contracts to see how they can wriggle out of this. But you know, a national blackout can hardly be considered an act of God. It's more like an act of man or woman. So the courts were very scathing about attempts by the insurance company to wriggle out of their liabilities for loss of business in the COVID crisis. And I'm sure they would not look kindly on such efforts, in the case of a national blackout. And insurance companies would probably default on their contracts in such a case. So that gives you an idea of the consequences of a national blackout.
My goodness, Chris, it's a bit of an apocalyptic picture that you're sketching.
Yes, but please, it is not a high probability.
Yes.
But it's happened before in other countries, so let's not say it's impossible.
Yeah, be prepared. About being prepared, What mitigation, are there mitigating factors that Eskom, for instance, or the Minister of Energy or his department are taking at this stage to prevent this happening? Obviously, it's part of their job, and Gwedi Mantashe said it's not really his responsibility. He's not seeing it as his responsibility. These things are worrying. What mitigating steps are being taken now?
Firstly, let me get to Minister Mantashe's statement, which, as I say, is deeply worrying and actually quite wrong. I have a copy of his performance contract with the president. It's in the public domain. You can download it from the website. And it's absolutely clear he is indeed responsible. He is responsible for increasing the energy availability factor to 85%. It's in his contract. He signed it, that very page which says that. So any effort for him to try and say, I am not responsible, it's not my job, it's the Minister of Public Enterprise, it's Eskom, but it's not me, is simply wrong. His performance contract is in the public domain. So he should be taking the necessary action, but I fear that things are not treated with the level of seriousness that they should be taken. But to move on to your second point is what actually is being done. Well, I think Eskom is finally getting the message that this is a national emergency that could turn into a state of disaster. They have called a so-called Eskom roundtable with, first of all, energy experts, and then with large industry associations, and then with financiers to come up with a plan to end load shedding. And this has started, this work has started, and in due course, this plan will be, after it's been workshopped properly and a lot of consultation has taken place, I think in about August, early September, this plan will be placed in the public domain and handed over to government. I think Eskom CEO is reaching the stage. You see, he's being held accountable, but his hands are tied behind his back. The solutions for new generation capacity do not come from him. He's not empowered to do it. He's not allowed to do it. The new generation capacity comes from the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. He is accountable. It's in his performance contract, and he has got to do it. So Eskom is being held accountable by the public, by the media, in Parliament, but their hands are tied behind their back, and there's very little they can actually do about bringing a new generation capacity on the grid, which is the only solution. Of course, they have to do maintenance. Yes. Of course, they have to finish Medupi and Kusile. Of course, demand-side management, energy efficiency, and all the other levers that they have at their disposal. But none of that will solve load shedding. So load shedding means new generation capacity, and that's the hands of the minister. But I think Eskom is reaching the stage where they are saying, listen, you're holding us accountable. You've tied our hands behind our back. This is our plan. We've workshopped with all the necessary people. If you don't implement this thing, you better find somebody else to.
Wow. Chris, you mentioned a few role players now, like, the CEO. We spoke about the minister. I want to quickly speak about the unions, because we all know that the strike or the protest that's been going on has also had an influence on keeping the lights on. How much power does the unions actually have at this stage, and how badly has this affected Eskom in keeping the power on?
Yeah, first thing I want to say is that this labour unrest is obviously a factor that worsens the situation. But if this labour problem and this wage dispute gets resolved tomorrow, we still have a major problem. We will revert back to the old normal. That means stage 2 to stage 4 load shedding. So whilst it is making things worse for the time being, the underlying problem is not a wage dispute, obviously. But how much power do the unions have? Enormous power. They can bring this country to its knees if they embark on the kind of industrial action that they did. It immediately went up from stage 4 to stage 6 load shedding, with a threat of going to stage 8 load shedding. So you remember we had stage 2 to stage 4 load shedding before the industrial action. Eskom said that the industrial action itself was putting about 4,000 megawatts at risk. Now 4,000 megawatts translates to another 4 stages of load shedding. So whilst we had stage 2 to stage 4 load shedding, the industrial action, placed us at risk of stage 6 to stage 8 load shedding. Fortunately, that risk has abated as the parties are back at the negotiating table. There have been some, revised offers put in front of the unions. They're still considering it, and let's hope that a resolution is achieved soon. Because if they go back out on strike, a wildcat strike, or the workers don't listen to their unions and continue with its existing strike, this could go on for longer, and it could get worse.
It could get worse, yeah. It's interesting as well. I know the workers haven't been, most of them haven't had an increase for the last 4 years, and that is obviously stressful. But since COVID, a lot of us also took a lot of.
Can I just correct you there?
Yes, please.
They have had increases for the last 4 years. The people that haven't had increases for the last couple of years are the executives and the management, the senior management.
A different story
the
being
workforce,
different tune being sung by the NUM. So that's interesting.
Yes.
Chris, just a correction on my side. I referred to the NUM earlier. It's not the NUM, it's NUMSA, and their spokesperson Pakamile Hlubi Majola that made claims that the members did not get an increase in 4 years. That's my mistake. But I want to move on to solutions. I want to move on to something constructive. What can be done now, specifically moving away maybe from fossil fuels like coal and the diesel that we're burning at this stage to keep the gas turbines going? What can we do? Something sustainable.
Yeah, so firstly, it's so easy for us to fall into a feeling of helplessness, that there's nothing that can be done. We've had load shedding for the last 15 years, and that we are kind of helpless in the face of this. Of course, this is not correct, but it is true to say that if we continue to do what we've been doing for the last 10 to 15 years, things will not get better, they will get worse. A recent study by Meridian Economics very clearly showed that if we had had an extra 5,000 megawatts of wind and solar PV alone last year, if we had, their modeling shows absolutely 100% clear that load shedding would have been reduced by 95%.
And that is not the bulk of the energy mix.
At the moment, it's not, but it would have contributed to reducing the current levels of load shedding from stage 2 to stage 4 to almost no load shedding whatsoever. Wind and solar at a level of about 5,000 megawatts. And remember that 5,000 megawatts had been intended to be on the grid last year.
Yes.
But because of Mr. Molefe and Mr. Coco, who put an end to Eskom connecting power from the Renewable Energy IPP program, that program was stopped in its tracks for 5 years. So what I'm telling you is that it's absolutely clear that had that program not been stopped in its tracks, we would not be experiencing load shedding last year.
Who can we blame for this? I mean, we spoke about Minister Gwedi Mantashe earlier, but is the National Energy Regulator to blame for this? Where should we go now for answers?
You can point the finger, and I do, at government, at NERSA, at Eskom, at its former management, at state capture, at all of these things, at the failure of Madupi and Kusili for the last, they should have been on the grid, 7 years ago in 2014. They're still not on the grid, and that which is on the grid is performing badly.
Yeah.
We can play the game, blame game for as long as we like. It not going to change something. We need to start looking at solutions. And I'm telling you that the solution for last year would have been an extra 5,000 megawatts of wind and solar on the grid.
Yes.
And the solutions going forward have been clearly outlined also in this part 2 of the Meridian study, which shows, and I also have put on the table to Eskom at the Eskom round table that I referred to earlier, and a kind of a national priority plan. That if we execute this plan and we can deliver 10,000 megawatts of new wind and solar PV and 5,000 megawatts of new battery energy storage, in addition to all the normal things that we've got planned, including the Renewable Energy IPP program, and energy efficiency, demand side management, more maintenance, finishing Medupi and Kusiti. Those sort of things I take for granted. Those have to be done. Any good utility has to do all of those things.
Yes.
But if we can deliver an extra 10,000 megawatts of wind and solar and 5,000 megawatts of battery storage, we will end load shedding in its tracks within 2 years. So that is the plan on the table. And people might say, oh, well, that's not possible. Of course it's possible. I want to just give you an example. In Vietnam, a country that is probably on a similar level of development to South Africa. They have high levels of poverty and rural inequality, but their cities are quite advanced, as are ours. In 1 year alone, they brought to the grid 9,000 megawatts of solar PV in the rooftop, domestic, and commercial sector alone. That is what can be done if you put in place a plan, you incentivize it properly, and you let literally thousands and thousands of customers become part of the solution, building self-generation, embedded generation, and wheeling across the grid on a huge scale by thousands and thousands of projects running concurrently. That is the power of the customer and the private sector, and it's not in the power of government and public procurements to achieve that. You only have to look at the so-called risk mitigation IPP program. President was recalled from Egypt in December 2019 to deal with stage 6 load shedding, and he announced that there would be the so-called emergency risk mitigation IPP program, which was intended to bring 2,000 megawatts, only 2,000 megawatts onto the grid on an emergency basis. Well, it's now 2.5 years later, and the order hasn't even been placed. And it's unlikely that it's going to be placed shortly. In fact, all they've done is they've announced preferred bidders. They haven't placed the orders. The financial closure has not been achieved, but they have announced preferred bidders. And one of those preferred bidders, Skatec, on 3 projects of 150 megawatts only, 150 out of 200 megawatts, 150 megawatts out of 2,000 megawatts, they have signed power purchase agreements, and that is 2.5 years later. These things still have to be built. They still have to be installed. It's going to take another 15, 16, 18 months, to bring to the grid. That is not dealing with the emergency.
Yes, and while we're talking about things that still need to be built, Kuberg at this stage, we're still waiting for for the steam turbines. There's a very tight schedule in the maintenance at Kuberg to get it done. Do you believe there will be enough time for this to finish and it'll happen in time?
Well, firstly, to say it's not actually maintenance we're talking about here. It's a so-called life extension.
Life extension, yes.
So their operating license runs out in July 2024. And they started a program to replace one of the major plant items, which was the steam generators. These things were supposed to be made in France. They were supposed to have been completed years ago. And the French ran into problems. They had to ship these half-completed steam generators to China to complete. When they arrived in China, they had a look at them there. They decided that these things were beyond salvation. So they scrapped them and started again. 3 of the steam generators are on site. Another 2 haven't arrived yet, but are arriving shortly. And the last one will only arrive in December. The steam generator replacement of unit number 2 was abandoned halfway through the project and still hasn't even started. And of course, the Unit 1 hasn't even started. The reactors are not even on site. The steam generators are not even on site yet. There is a there is a growing risk that this may not be completed in time to extend their license by another 20 years. Okay, but we have to see how that plays out. But the risk is growing. There have been a lot of serious mistakes. They started the project on unit number 2 without even having the building ready that is going to house the radioactive old steam generators that get taken out and have to be put in a radiation containment building for a time to allow them to cool off. So when they started this shutdown in the end of January this year, they had to abandon the project halfway through because this building was not complete. So that just kind of shows you, there's a difference between, the plan and the reality, and there are real risks involved.
Chris, I want to ask, earlier you mentioned the roundtable that was called in August. Those plans will be in public domain. And I have to be honest, I think most of the public is skeptical when it comes to being announced that there are plans for Eskom and a way forward. How reliable is that roundtable, the people involved? And quickly, can we depend that there will be a difference being made in August? We have about a minute left.
Yeah. So firstly, I must say that this is not a plan for Eskom. Eskom is in absolutely no position to build any new generation capacity in the next 2 years. Absolutely none. So this plan is not a plan for Eskom. It's a plan for us, for industry, business, commerce, customers of electricity, and the role of Eskom is to create an enabling environment to ensure that there's adequate grid connection available to deliver this 10,000 megawatts plus 5,000 megawatts of battery storage or other solutions that may be brought to the table. But I believe that the intentions are sound. I believe they're going to put a solid plan on the table. But Eskom itself is not in a position to implement it. It will have to be a national, coordinated priority plan where the private sector will be doing the solutions.
And it's time that we as a private sector start throwing our weight behind the program. Thank you very much, Chris, for being here this morning and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.